Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so my name is Paul Cutting. I work with the Winneshiek Energy District up here in Decorah. Essentially, I do energy auditing work, provide technical assistance work to homeowners, business owners, and lots of work with nonprofits. So I routinely have conversations with individuals and organizations that are potentially interested in solar. Um, so like I mentioned earlier, the basis of this is kind of to help you all understand how you can also begin to have those conversations with people and like what the general framework around solar is and what there's a lot there. Solar is incredibly complicated. It's governed by rules from the utility. There's a lot to know. But if you get kind of the basics squared away, you can have a semi-intelligent conversation with someone. Um, so a few concepts just to start off with net metering. So net metering is basically the ability to export power back out onto the grid to receive credit for the power that you're supplying the grid at a later time. So keep in mind, most solar production happens, well, first of all, during the day when the sun is shining, on sunny days, and usually during the summer months. If you look at where your electric consumption is, depending on what your usage patterns are, most of your consumption might happen when the sun is not shining at night, during the winter. And what net metering provides the customer basically is the ability to receive credit for the power that they're supplying the grid. Some of that power, when they produce it, is going to be used on site at the time it's produced, whereas a big portion of it is going to be probably exported back out onto the grid. And being able to receive credit for the power you export is what we call net metering. Net metering really makes solar affordable. And depending on who your utility is and like what geographic location you sit, solar might be favorable or solar might not be favorable. It really depends on what the net metering rules are that are supplied by your utility. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. A lot of this is kind of Alliant centric. So Decorah is served by Alliant Energy, which is one of two large investor-owned utilities in the state of Iowa, the other being Mid-American. So I apologize that this is very Alliant centric, but this is kind of the lingo I know and what we talk about with people up here in Decorah. So for Alliant customers, they basically receive retail net metering, which is basically they're compensated for the dollar value of what they export back out onto the grid to then draw down. So some utilities might keep track of your net metering in the form of kilowatt hours that you export out onto the grid, whereas net metering with Alliant takes the form of a dollar compensation. So your account basically is in the form of a dollar value as opposed to a kilowatt hour value. Now, that said, there's all sorts of caveats with all of this. Different customers have entered solar at different time periods when different arrangements were in place. This pertains to the most recent, what we call tariff with Alliant. Previous customers are on previous generations of the tariff, which look different. I'm not going to go into any of that, but that's just something to know. Um, and feel free to jump in. Like, don't, I've got 8 slides here. It'll take probably 20 minutes if I'm not being clear, but like, by all means, interject and ask a question or ask for clarification. Um, so when I'm talking to someone, basically what you want to understand, given that you're compensated for the full retail value of the electricity you're providing the grid, what does that mean? What is the full retail value? So here on this slide is basically a customer bill from what looks like the month of August. And on the Alliant customer bill, there are basically two categories that are broken down. One is what we call volumetric. Volumetric charges correspond to the energy that was consumed or produced. And then there are also fixed charges. The fixed charges include sales tax. Depending on your location, you may have what we call a franchise fee, and then basically the basic service charge. So when you look at solar, the value of what you're getting credit for only corresponds to the portions that relate to the volumetric side of your bill, not the fixed side of your bill. So on the bill right here, you see I circled here in red where it says kilowatt hours times 27 days, kilowatt hours times a certain number. Anything that has a kilowatt associated with it corresponds to a volumetric charge. And then the last three on here, those are your fixed charges: the service charge, the local option sales tax, and the state I can't say it, state sales tax. So if you total up the volumetric charges here on the right hand side, you get $198.43. On the month that we're looking at here, the customer used 1,130 kilowatt hours. If you take $198, divide that by 1,130 kilowatt hours, you get a price per kilowatt of 17.56 cents. So if this customer in theory were to add solar, you could expect during this month, it varies by the time of the year, but during this month, that any solar that they were to export back out onto the grid, they would receive 17.56 cents in compensation for each kilowatt hour exported.
Paul,
Yeah,
first, that was just an excellent explanation. So thank you for that. I think that's really good. And I would only add, just by comparison, our place is on the Alliant Clayton electric cooperative lines.
yep,
And so on
yep,
the fixed charges, it looks like it's about $35 for every month. An Alliant customer is going to spend about $35 a month just to be for the luxury to be connected to the grid, whereas a Alliant Clayton REC member is going to be paying. Ours is just short of $50 a month. So no matter
yep,
what, if we buy a kilowatt or not, you're going to pay $50 just for that connection.
yep,
And then I also wanted to say that, like, again, on the volumetric, the off on thing, the kilowatt on and kilowatt off, I mean, paying it by the dollar is certainly how Alliant does it, but the REC is also straight up kilowatt hour
kilowatt
value. So
hours.
it
Yep,
really does matter. The circumstances, and then of course a muni could be very different, and my energy could be very different as well. So
yep,
it varies on location. I know it looks like we've got two Clayton County Energy District board members here, and then somebody from Winneshiek. So
yep.
maybe we don't need to
Yeah,
talk anymore on
yeah,
that.
yeah, definitely. People cite Alliance rates as being really high. They are very high. They're one of the highest in the Midwest. Um, that's unfortunate if you're paying if you're a customer, but also if you're a solar customer, it works out to your advantage because the net metering rules are so favorable to solar customers that the return on investment for solar becomes really, really short. Whereas in other markets, like for you, Jolene, in the REC, when you're only paying 11 cents a kilowatt hour, anything you export back out on the grid has a significantly less value associated with it. So it definitely cuts both ways. So generally speaking, how much solar can you install? It depends on your utility, but usually it's any amount. The question is more how much of that can you net meter? So that very much depends on the utility. For Alliant customers, it's basically you can net meter basically you can justify installing so much solar that will correspond to what your past usage is. So what they're trying to prevent you from doing is turning your solar array into a cash register. So I can't over install my solar and then receive all these like dollar credits for what I'm producing. I'm only able to net meter a value that corresponds to what my past consumption has been. And that very much varies by utility too. So for example, My Energy here, which is a local REC, they basically have taken the position that, well, you can install however much solar you want. It's just at the end of the year, come the 1st of April, if you have more in your account than 2,000 kilowatt hours, you're only able to credit or you're only able to carry forward up to 2,000 kilowatt hours. So if you've over installed your solar and come April 1st, you have a whole bunch of credit in there, they're only going to be able to then carry forward 2,000 kilowatt hours. So it very much does vary by utility. Um, Something that's really handy that I always use. So when I'm, at an event we're doing, and someone says, "Hey, I want to put solar on my roof." The first thing I do is say, "Is what's your address?" So if you type in Alliant usage lookup tool on Google, you'll find their page, and basically what this allows you to do is um, enter their address. So this is 307 Terrace Street in Decorah here. And what it'll provide you here is basically over the last 12 months, what's the month with the highest usage, the month with the lowest usage, and the month with the monthly, or excuse me, and what's the 12-month rolling average. So if we look on the right side here, the 12-month rolling average, it says kilowatt hours. It says 1,647 kilowatt hours consumed per month. So if I were to take 1,647, multiply it by 12, I'm going to get an annual total of 19,764 kilowatt hours that were consumed over the last month. Um, so then taking that one step further, so that's what their usage is over the last month. What might solar look like for that customer? And this, I'm just going to kind of gloss over this. But there's a tool called pvwatts.gov. And what pvwatts.gov allows you to do basically is to depending on the orientation of the array, the level of losses that you might have from shading or the orientation or the pitch of the array. Is it at 37 degrees? Is it at 5 degrees? You can enter all this into pvwatts.gov and it's going to provide you a number of kilowatt hours produced per year based on the amount of solar installed. So what I show right here, where it says 1,343 kilowatts a year, that means that for 1 kilowatt of solar, it's going to produce 1,343 kilowatts of electricity annually based on the set of criteria that I entered, a certain pitch, a certain orientation, a certain losses for shading. I'm not going to get into any of that. What I'm trying to get at here, though, is kind of how do you arrive at what the rough estimate would be for what the customer could install, and then ultimately what's the cost of that. So just kind of taking this at face value here, we're going to say that 1 kilowatt of solar is going to produce 1,343 kilowatts of electricity. So from Alliant's perspective, how much are they allowing you to basically net meter? How you do that then would be to take your total annual consumption of 19,764 and divide that by 1,343, which is going to give you a system size of 14.7 kilowatts. So a kilowatt is 1,000 watts. So this system, if we were to install a system like this, and if we wanted it to offset all of our electric use over the last 12 months, we'd have to install a system that's sized to 14.7 kilowatts. Um, so in our market, rooftop solar costs about 200, or it costs about $2.25 a watt. So if I wanted to arrive at what would the total cost be for this customer, I would take the 14.7 kilowatts. I'm going to multiply that by $2.25 a watt, and I'm going to arrive at a price of $33,075. Now, on top of that, depending on your location, there's at least 30% back that you'd be able to receive in the form of the tax credit. So we would take that off of the, I'll show you that on the next slide here. But there are potential reductions in that price. Questions on that portion of things? Like there's a lot in there, and I'm sorry to gloss over big, huge categories, but I just want to kind of give you the framework for how I go about doing this.
Yeah, Paul, I just have one question. So Alliant Energy right now is not limiting system size to 80 or 90, isn't it? Isn't there some limitation on the size of the system as far as total usage or
It's
demand?
it's about a in theory it's 110. In practice, depending on what the situation is of the roof, the orientation, the shading, the pitch of the panels, it could be as low as like 80 to 85%. But in theory, it's 110. So, and the rules governing that are really complicated. So I've been talking about the last 12 months of usage. If you look at like the rules, it's actually more complicated than that. It's like the last 3 years of
Oh, geez.
usage. Like all of that is not important. There's a lot that goes into it. But
Yeah,
in theory, a customer should be able to net meter basically all of what their consumption is. So if you want to install solar, you should be able to install solar that offsets all of your past usage.
gotcha.
So then taking this one step further, now there's a heck of a lot on the slide here. First of all, can you see the numbers here?
Yes.
Okay, okay. So on the left-hand side, I have a series of assumptions. So where it's orange with all the green below it. So I'm just going to kind of walk through what the assumptions are on here. So on the system size, our system size for this particular array is 14.7 kilowatts. The next row on here is annual usage for this house. It consumed 19,764 kilowatt hours. From our PV watts that we calculated, we're going to assume that 1 kilowatt of solar produces 1,343 kilowatt hours of electricity annually. And then in our market, given this is a rooftop array, we can expect that solar costs about $2.25 a watt installed. Now, if you go to a big city or a different market where there aren't many players, many contractors, that $2.25 might be $1.80 or it might be $3.50. It's probably going to be closer to the $3.50 side than the $1.80 side. So this is very specific to what I see here in Decorah. So based on the previous slides where it says total array cost, we have $33,075. We have the energy costs here of 14.75 cents. Annual production. So we're sizing this array to basically produce as much electricity as we have used over the last year. Then below that, we have the dollar value of annual production. So this is simply 14.75 cents a kilowatt hour times the amount of production. So the annual production of 19,742 kilowatts, which means that every year the system is going to produce $2,913 worth of electricity. Um, Below that, we have the 30% tax credit. And then depending on your location, there might be another 10% available. So we have the energy community adder, which is what we sometimes see depending on where you're at. So the tax credit is going to be valued at least 30%, if not 40%. So I'm saying that of the $33,000 of investment that you make, you're going to receive a tax credit of $9,923. And then below that gives you your total cost after incentives of $23,153. And then below that, just scratch out the discount rate, ignore that. I didn't mean to include that here. Um, so then basically you have a series of columns to the right of that, which are in blue. So the first column is year. The next column is energy production. The column after that is energy cost. Then we have avoided costs. So an annual avoided cost, an annual cash flow, and then a cumulative cash flow. Um, so, for example, we'll just work through this here. So, on the year, we're basically modeling from year zero, from when we install the system, through 25 years. That's usually kind of what I look at it. It's a 25-year contract you're signing with Alliant. Your panels are warranted for 25 years. It's going to be there 25 years later. So, you want to think about it on that time horizon. Um, the next column, energy production. So, solar panels basically degrade over time, kind of at a rate of a half a percentage point every year. So as you work down through here, once you get to year 25, that solar array we could expect to produce about 16,985 kilowatt hours of electricity a year. So it's going to basically be producing about 80% of what its original capacity was. So we're compensating for that over time. And then we have energy cost. This is the cost of electricity. So we're going to start at 14.8 cents a kilowatt hour. And then we're going to assume that energy costs escalate every year by 3%. So after year 25, we're going to assume that a kilowatt hour of electricity is going to be valued at 30.9 cents. Um, when I do this type of work, I'm pretty conservative. So I'm conservative in, so when we say energy costs, we're looking at the value of the solar. So what's the value of that energy going to be over time? The 3% cost escalation, if you look at like, for example, alliance rates, it's actually a little bit higher than 3%. So I'm trying to be conservative in what we forecast out, so that we're not over promising. Um, and then the other point to keep in mind here is that installing solar, in addition to potentially cutting your electricity bill or a good portion of your electricity bill, it's also a great way to hedge against rate increases into the future. Because keep in mind that the value of what you export is pegged to those volumetric charges, which are associated for power that Alliant is selling you. So basically we're saying here every year that you export power back out onto the grid, the value of what you're exporting also becomes more valuable because alliance rates are also increasing and increasing and increasing over time. So installing solar is an excellent way to hedge against future rate increases. Um, Another thing to keep in mind and another selling point for solar. So then the second to last column is annual cash flow. Basically on a yearly basis, what does your cash flow look like? To me, that's really not the important one. Kind of the bread and butter here is the cumulative cash flow. So what does this look like cumulatively over time? So basically we're accounting for what our initial investment is in the system up front, and then we're going to subtract out year over year the energy cost or the avoided cost of what we're producing in solar. So if you work down the chart here, you'll see that by year 7, you turn from a negative cumulative cash flow to a positive cash flow. So that means after 7 years, I will have recouped my initial investment. So now I'm basically at break even point after year 7. Now you're signing a 25-year contract with Alliant. The value of your solar just keeps going up and up and up. If you then were to draw that out over the 25-year period, the cumulative cash flow at year 25 is $77,168. So that means that I will have repaid my initial investment and I will be ahead $77,000 after that 25-year period, which is pretty good. Um, like, is it as good as the stock market? No, it's not. But as someone who has to exist in the world and as someone who has to pay a utility bill, not paying your utility bill, or receiving compensation for what you're producing as a solar customer, like it makes a lot of sense. So finally here on the avoided cost column, if you go all the way down to the very bottom, so the avoided cost is just what the energy, the dollar value of the energy that this system is producing over 25 years, it's going to produce $100,320 of electricity. Questions about any of that? And then finally, the last slide is just what about other utilities? Joleen mentioned this earlier. So net metering rules vary by utility provider. Another thing to note is net metering is kind of generally speaking, going away, or full retail value net metering. Net metering in Iowa right now is incredibly favorable to the customer. In 10 years' time, that won't be so. States, whether they be red states or blue states, or however you want to look at it, whether they're highly regulated or more market driven, they're kind of all moving in the direction of away from being full retail value net metering to different arrangements where maybe your solar is worth a portion of the purchase price of what the utility sells electricity for. States like Minnesota have gone to a value of solar model where basically they're figuring out, well, what is the actual value of the power that you're producing, not the retail value, but what's the value to the to society, to other customers, to the utility, and then using that number to correspond to what the value of the solar is. But generally speaking, like if you're interested in solar, like now is the time to get into the game because the rules won't be this favorable, 5, 10 years from now. So my energy REC, like I mentioned, you can carry forward up to 2,000 kilowatt hours annually. For example, Alliant Clayton REC, they have a net metering program that resets every month. So basically for an Alliant Clayton REC, it's to size your system larger than your lowest month of consumption, but less than your highest month of consumption. One nice thing about Alliant Clayton REC is they've got someone there to work, Ryan Wagner, who will work with the customer and basically model this out for them and tell them exactly how much solar you should install, what's going to be to your greatest financial benefit given their net metering program. So a resource like that is great to tap into if you're in Elmeke Clayton. Other utilities, like a lot of RECs, don't offer net metering programs. I know there have been several within the state of Iowa that have recently basically watered down their net metering program. I know of one that's basically completely eliminated it. But basically, some other situations that you'll run into is basically where they're paying you avoided cost for any power you export back out onto the grid, which is basically the wholesale rate of the electricity, which varies based on season and market conditions, but that's anywhere from a cent and a half to roughly 4 cents a kilowatt hour. So in those situations, doing anything you can to either size your system such that you're keeping most of it behind the meter, or potentially utilizing strategies like, battery storage, banking energy. So if you're doing space heating with electricity, running your heat pump to basically utilize all the solar you're producing at the time it's being consumed, and then basically shutting off that or then, reducing your set point on your thermostat such that you're kind of maximizing what you're producing and keeping it behind the meter. So banking energy, being really strategic about when you're charging your EV, like there's lots of things that come into play. Um, yeah. So questions about any of that or other questions you have?
Yeah, Paul, I had the question you had mentioned. So that's something I hadn't heard before with Alliant Energy. That I know that these solar arrays are often warranted or guaranteed. 25 years is the typical lifetime. Are you saying that if you enter into a solar tariff with Alliant Energy, you are signing a 25-year contract with them?
You are. So it's
Mm.
20 or 20, it's 20 or 25 years. I want to say it's 25. I'm almost positive it's 25. Someone the other day just told me it was 20, and I'm hesitant to say that it's 20 or 25. But yes, you are. Unlike RECs, so for example, an REC can change its policy at any point. Um, and you're basically subject to what the most recent policy is of the REC. Whereas with Alliant, yes, you are basically signing a legal contract with them, which is going to grandfather you in. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. Okay. So okay, gotcha. Whatever you sign, and that actually is our personal experience too with Al McKee Clayton, in that we were when we put our panels up in 2015, they were offering annual cash out net metering, and so we still have that tariff with them here.
Yep.
But if we add to our array, which we likely will, then that all goes away and it goes to monthly.
For,
I also
yeah,
go ahead.
for sure. Yeah, yeah. Like when you look at is so uh, not to name names, but if you look at some RECs that have lots and lots of solar um, out on their grid, like an incredible amount of solar, the cost of the value of that solar that's being
Hmm.
exported back out onto the grid does not correspond to the value that the customer is being compensated for. So
Right.
over time, there is going to be a correction. So when I'm working with people out in REC territory, like this is a very delicate subject, but like it's something like in the value or in the spirit of providing like, non-biased worthwhile information that's not,
Hmm.
tainted in any way to say at the very least that, well, this is what the policy is now. Your utility has an incredible amount of solar on its territory right now. Their policy towards solar like very well may change, and what you forecast out or the 25-year nice spreadsheet that I provided you might not look like that 5 years from now. So that's like a
Gotcha.
very important thing to say.
It is. That's very. It's not the same as when they were. That's why energy districts have been so passionate about trying to get annual cash out policies or annual net metering policy in place. But I do think that leads to the question that I was about to say, and that is interesting. Maybe you'll share with this group a little bit more about what the actual value of solar study means, because that is where Iowa is. It's 2027, I believe, that we will be looking at a reevaluation of the codified net metering policy in Iowa. So we'll be looking at really doing a value of solar study, unless solar penetration exceeds such a number before that. I think that's the way the law
Yep,
goes.
yep, yep.
You might
So,
talk
so
about
I
the value
think
of solar and what it means.
maybe it would be useful to back up a step here. So
Sure.
what's the rub? Like, what's the problem if customers' compensation is more than what the actual value is to like society and other customers? The net effect of that is that you're driving costs onto those who don't have solar. That's the rub. And then in those scenarios, when you then get lots of solar onto the grid, what ends up happening is those who don't have solar end up paying for those who do have solar. So, and then in those situations, what you can then have are basically cost escalations. Like this has happened in California. California now, unfortunately, has, I don't know what the average retail rate per kilowatt, but it's like incredibly high, like 40, 50 cents a kilowatt, or kilowatt hour. And that is due to some degree by the amount of distributed solar they had on their grid and the fact that everyone who had solar was being compensated for all of the value they produced. Because keep in mind, in when the sun is shining, everyone's solar arrays are also producing electricity, and those peak times of production often don't correspond to the utilities need to provide power to every customer at every situation at every time of day, irregardless, like irrespective of what the load is. So what you produce at any given point might not actually have anything to do what it costs to provide you power at that specific moment in time. So you're basically distorting the market and creating situations where those who don't have solar basically are paying those who do have solar. And that's like the distortion that at some point, depending on where you are and your build out of solar on your utility, like that then becomes a distorting factor that has to be reconciled.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There is when they do value of solar studies, though, there is also the consideration of the lower transmission. So, for example, when we don't use all of the kilowatts that we produce during the day here, instead of the kilowatt hour having to come down being delivered to the neighbor from back when the Lansing coal plant was open from Lansing, as opposed to it just goes path of least resistance, it serves them. So there is some value to those kilowatts that you put out there. It just takes some, obviously that utility has to do a lot of management of that and a lot of gazinches, right? I mean, so it's
Yep.
not an entirely bad situation. It's just a rethinking of the grid and the interconnectedness of the grid. But I agree that there is some saturation that needs to, obviously load management is a big part of that is the rub, is the
Yep.
load management. Yeah.
And I believe Illinois is going through this process beginning the first of the year. I think all their investor-owned utilities, their net metering policies are going away from full net metering to, I don't know if it's a value of solar or a reduced, but it's the rules are totally changing in
Mm-hmm.
Illinois, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's going to take a long time, isn't it, to get it all caught up? Battery storage, there's going to be a lot more on-site battery storage behind the meter storage and that kind of thing. So, but your slides, the payout, the whole situation is super helpful.
Any other questions or?
Hey, Paul, it's Kristen. I have a question.
Oh, you're on
Um,
here. Oh, I'm sorry. I said, and oh, I thought that was me. I'm sorry.
I
I
know
didn't
we're the
realize
same
I didn't.
today on
Yeah.
Zoom. Um, I was curious a little bit about rooftop solar versus ground mount, and if you're noticing any trends as to, it seemed like at first everyone was getting rooftop. You notice a lot of ground mount out in the country. Are you noticing, I guess, trends or preferences by solar installers? So that's kind of part one of the question. And part two has more to do with, not that I expect you to be an expert on this, but curious if others on the call have heard about any pushback from fire departments on rooftop solars. That's a comment that I have come across out and about, and was curious a little bit about, yeah, rooftop solar and any of those types of considerations.
The first one, it's totally situation dependent. I think ideally a ground mount array makes more sense. So I threw on the number of $2.25 a watt installed for a roof mount array. If you look at our market, for example, a ground mount array is probably going to be $2.75. The benefit of a ground mount array is you can point it directly south and at an ideal pitch, whereas your roof might not allow for that. The other obvious benefit is you're not relying on the integrity of a roof. So not having to take your panels off 20 years from now or when the hailstorm comes or whatever. So it's totally situation dependent. Yeah, generally speaking, out in the country, like if you've got the space, a ground mount array, it's going to push out your payback period a little bit, but it's a better situation overall, I think, for most people. And then the other portion, yes. So like, for example, like the International Building Code, that's all spelled out as the like what the setbacks are for. So like on an array, it has to be placed within the certain confines of a roof. Most contractors understand what those are. They're not going to pack a whole rooftop filled with solar. Like they're going to allow those clearances. So, for example, if a fire department has to chop a hole in the peak of your roof to expel smoke or whatever, solar contractors, generally speaking, understand what those rules are. And then in locations that are governed by building codes that are enforced, those are going to be part of the building code inspection process and all of that.
Awesome, thanks.
Mhm. Sweet. Well, thanks for coming, everyone, on this Tuesday night.
Thank you, Paul, for the time to put this all together. And the spreadsheet is just really, really helpful.
Yeah, and
Thank you for
Christine,
that.
we'll make this into a video. We'll be sure someone reached out, asked if we were going to record it. We'll be sure to push the video portion of this. If you have feedback, like definitely let me know if there's a topic. So I guess what my goal here is to do, a few of these, maybe in a few weeks, depending on Christmas schedule. But to keep doing these, if you have a suggestion for topics or anything like that, definitely reach out. Um, so yeah, hopefully it's something that you found useful and hope to see you again.